Well, let me start by saying that this paper sketches out a philosophical account of a controversial but really central and distinctive feature of contemporary art school education, group critiques, or crits, as they're widely known. And I should say here, somewhat parenthetically, this paper, a rather larger version of this paper is appearing soon, I think at the end of this year, the beginning of next year, in a Routledge companion, the companion to Criticality in Art, Architecture and Design, which is edited by two South Australians, Chris Brisbane and Myra Tyson. But it is also the central part of a larger project I have done, a largely written book project on art schools and contemporary artist training. That project, I mean, the aim there is really to take philosophical approaches and make them useful to artists, make them useful to the art world in certain ways. And I hope this paper will give you a sense, especially if you have experience with art schools yourself. It'll give you a sense of the general flavour outline of the broader project. Okay, so crits have only occasionally been the subject of scholarly reflection, and only once in James Elkins's book, Why Art Cannot Be Taught, have they received sustained theoretical attention. He's since produced a book which is a kind of guide for students too, which focuses just on critiques as well, I should say. So this neglect is odd, since crits are central to much art school education, and they're valued in many art schools as a mainstay of studio art teaching, as one prominent teacher has put it. Yet, at the same time, there is also doubt about their value. So to take in the book, I'm assembling pages and pages of criticisms of crits. Elkins is sceptical of their value, as I'll give you a little more detail on shortly. And others take a more extreme position. The art critic Dave Hickey, an American, thinks that they, quote, preserve the verbal over the visual and allow faculty members to poison and manipulate peer relations among their students. And if you think that is bad, Griselda Pollock actually says worse things about crits. And I think, although she does so without citing evidence, I've found evidence that really suggests that she is certainly quite right, certainly regarding how they're practiced in the 1960s and 70s, when the practice first developed. One interesting thing, again, parenthetically, there is no history of this really almost unique form of artistic training. It really is, in many art schools, especially in MA programs, especially in America, it's how art schools are trained. It's how art is taught. It's how students get feedback. And that is, it is where you are getting feedback, where education occurs. So I want to say that crits, I want to defend crits. I want to say that crits practiced well do have an educational value. And here I'll sketch a hypothesis about how crits work and what their educational value is when they do work. I also will venture, if I have time, another point based on this idea that crits play an important role in instilling a certain kind of concept of art, and by virtue of that, they shape contemporary art as well. And that should not be so surprising that, you know, education, artist training shapes artists, shapes the art that is produced. Okay, so a few words about crits. Crits, as they're now currently practiced in art schools, are a relatively recent development. As I say, there is no history of them, but it seems that they date roughly from the 1960s, but became, certainly in the UK, and I think here, widespread in the 1970s and 1980s. I haven't found the term in the 1960s in the UK. I haven't found the term crit used in any systematic way. In America, they're called critiques, and I've used that term already. I suspect, I don't know, some here may have a better idea. I suspect that they may actually have begun in the UK in the 1960s. In a selection of art schools where they were known as group criticisms. And I'd be very interested to know if you have earlier examples. Okay, along with some other forms of teaching, in particular one-to-one student-tutor teaching, crits are the major kind of teaching class for master's level and later bachelor level, undergraduate level students in most art schools. I should make one exception to that, and I think it's a very interesting one. Crits barely exist. They're absolutely central in English-speaking art schools. They barely exist, barely seem to exist in most art schools in Europe, where there are quite different practices. Crits are practiced in different ways at different art schools. Most, however, fit with the following broad model, which I'll take as typical. So, first, the student presents their work to a group of fellow students and teachers. They actually have to physically have the work present. They will have it hung up on a wall, presented in the middle of a space, or perhaps performed or projected or whatever for the crit group. The crit begins typically with the student explaining their work and their intentions for it to the group. The group then responds to both work and statement with comments and questions, so that a conversation typically develops about the work between the student and the group. And crits can vary in length. They're usually 20 minutes is regarded as a very short crit. I think just under an hour seems to be more common. The artist and educator Michael Asher in LA held crits famously at CalArts that ran for several hours each. That is, say, several hours looking at a single student's work. So it will be useful here to distinguish two kinds of crits very quickly. First are crits in which the primary purpose is assessment. These are typically held at the end of a module or course. In addition to the students' lecturers and classmates being present, you may have other teachers at the school, visiting artists, and so on. It is these visiting artists, it's the permanent staff members that make up an assessment panel. They take the lead in questioning the students and in whatever exchanges ensue. And after the crit, the panel meets to decide the student's grade. That's the version which I'm not really interested in here. I'm not interested in assessment. I'm interested in feedback and pedagogy. And what I will call pedagogical crits are those held usually, for the most part, during a course or module with an audience comprising the course module lecturer or lecturers, the teachers, and crucially, the students' classmates. So here, the lecturers take less of a lead in the crit, typically allowing and encouraging the other students to take an active role. The student is expected to learn from these interactions with their audience, and such crits may be repeated for each student a few times during, say, a term. Okay, so that's an outline of what crits are for those of you who don't know. As I've said, James Elkins makes the only substantial study of crits in contemporary art schools. And as he's more pessimistic about the value of crits than I am, it'll be worth briefly assessing aspects of his account. He argues that crits are an ineffective method of teaching, for they are, quote, in effect, simply too complicated to understand. And he gives a range of reasons for thinking this. I can't, if you know Elkins' writing, if he makes a claim, he will give usually between 7, 9, or 11 reasons why it is so, and it goes on and on. So I have to just select a few. The most pressing points seem to me to be the following two. One, he observes that crits are often too short, at 30 or 45 minutes, where he works, in the Art Institute of Chicago, to fully engage with the students' work. Second, teachers speak from, as indeed do other members of the audience, students, speak from a wide range of different positions, which students are often ignorant of, and that makes it difficult for a student to appropriately contextualize the feedback they get. And that's especially difficult when teachers disagree, when feedback from teachers contradicts, when teachers contradict one another, or when they make idiosyncratic remarks. So I think it's clear that Elkins' conclusions are weakened because he studies only assessment crits. He's right, and I should say they are a very distinctive form of the master's teaching in the US. He's right that these have a limited pedagogical value, I think. That's not a surprise, since that's not their main purpose. In the case of pedagogical crits, Elkins' criticisms are less compelling. Because pedagogical crits are held more often, students have more time to become familiar with the perspectives of their teachers and their classmates. The conversation that starts in one crit can be carried on in later crits of the student's work. And this is something recognised by the art historian Howard Singerman, who makes some interesting references to crits in his book, a very important book on American art schools. And he describes how, quote, each crit's presentation begins with the last work and from where the discussion around it paused. In the case of American master's students, where a student is in effect part of a single class for up to 2 years, the length, and it's the same in this country, the length of that conversation is effectively set by the program's duration. And so students have ample time to develop a sense of the various perspectives of their teachers, their classmates. So I'm sceptical of the claim that pedagogical crits are too complex for students to understand. And we'll see that it is important for my account that effective communication can occur in crits. Still, I allow that they are often difficult to understand. And Elkins makes many other good points about this difficulty. For instance, crits can become very emotional. This is feedback that is given face to face. And it is not uncommon for crits to run out of control in unproductive ways, sometimes reducing students to tears. And Elkins mentions this, and I and others have seen it happen and remark on it too. And clearly, when that happens, it is not a moment in which productive learning can occur. So while I reject the full force of Elkins' criticisms, it's clear that crits are not as effective in their format for conveying knowledge to students as, say, lectures or a one-to-one tutorial is, which are not subject to the distractions and prolixities of group conversation. That is to say, group crits are not really an effective way of transmitting knowledge. or methods, skills. So what then do crits do? So let me begin my answer by looking very quickly at a Bauhaus teaching technique that some of you will have familiarity with, I think. And I bring it up because it bears some relation to crits as we know them, and perhaps is a kind of ancestor of them, I suspect. So the great German-American art educator and artist Joseph Albers, in his book Interaction of Colour, describes how at Yale, from the 1930s to the 1950s, he would require students to develop solutions to a set formal problem, which he would then get them to bring into class. So he would, for instance, get students to draw a diagram of two overlapping shapes, say a circle and another circle, a square and a triangle. They overlap. You then colour in find a colour for the square, find a colour for your triangle, and then you try and find a colour for that area of overlap that will create an effect of transparency. So you have to get just the right colour, so it creates an effect of seeing one colour through the other, as if like a transparent gauze. And he set his students to this problem and many others. Okay, so these studies, he writes, quote, would then be compared and evaluated by the entire class, students and teacher. That is to say, the group would assess each study as a solution to the set problem. And though the problem is preset, the group's experiences are the only basis of judgment for success or failure. And Albers explicitly rejects the idea that any kind of science or colour theory should be the basis for such judgment. That is to say, he sat round all these samples that the students had worked on, and they would look at them together and try and find the most effective solutions to the problem. The ones that, through their own, via their own perceptions, were the most effective, were the most compelling. So in this, Albers appeals to a kind of a common sense, where by common I mean shared. The capacity for this common sense is something that is shared equally by teachers and students. So Albers makes clear. And he is happy that individuals may differ in their particular judgments here and there, but he assumes that for the most part there will be a convergence of judgment, that members of the group will mostly see things the same way when they look carefully. Now, crits are similar to this Bauhaus teaching in terms of their group teaching structure. In both, students present their work to the group for judgment, and also in both, it is the group's response to the work. In a pedagogical crit, the responses of both teachers and students together, that provides the standard of judgment. There are, of course, a number of points of difference. So let me draw attention to two that seem to me crucial. First, the crit differs from Albers' kind of teaching in that it allows the students complete freedom in what they present for the group's presentation. It's not simply the solution to a set problem. It's anything that they want to be. They want to give consideration to. They want to present as a candidate for artistic appreciation, if you like. So the group will literally consider anything the student presents. Second, once the group has heard the student's initial account of the work, the group has a complete freedom in its response, or individuals do. Individuals in the group can respond by, for instance, describing any kind of perception, thought, judgment, or suggestion the work may prompt. So the aim of crits, I suggest that the aim of crits may be thought of as encouraging students to develop work in which the students' interests in the work converge with those of the group. By interests, I mean the reasons that the students and the group have for valuing the work. I don't mean interest here in the Kantian sense. Rather, I'm broadly inspired by Donald Judd's statement that a work need only be interesting. So developing such a convergence is typically a complex process. As I've said, when a student work is first presented in a crit, the student gives an account of the work. This typically includes an account of their interest in it, the reasons they have for valuing it. The group's initial response will typically include various accounts of what qualities its members find of interest, or where such qualities could be developed by their lights in the work. Especially in the case of early student work, as those of you involved in art schools will know, this will normally diverge, sometimes dramatically, from the students' interests. In particular, the group will likely have a range of interests beyond those of the students. So a student might begin making, say, an abstract or a figurative painting, fairly conventional, but the group's interests, the group will ask questions about and make remarks about other features of the work, the more general kind of phenomenology the work affords the viewer, perhaps its symbolic qualities, its connotations, maybe certain kinds of indexical meanings, the significance of the way marks were made, as well as, very importantly, historical context, social, political, ideological readings that are made of the imagery or the kind of imagery that is made. And often the students may not even have thought about many of these things, but the group's interest in them shows how such a meaning could be developed and endorses such a meaning as being at least potentially of value, potentially of interest. A painter might not have thought about the support they paint on, the way the work is hung, or about the social and political connotations that accompany their chosen subject matter. But the group usually will draw attention to all these things and show how they might come to have some kind of value in the work. Lucy Suter, in a short study of the influence of conceptualism on art school teaching in Frieze, makes just such a point about crits. She writes, "This kind of training forces students to extend their sense of engagement beyond their own experience and the image or object they have made to consider its edges and external supports, as well as the phenomenological, social, historical, political, institutional implications of the work." So in this way, the group's responses will suggest ways in which the work could attain a broader and more complex significance. Following a crit, the student is expected to act on this, revising and developing both their work and their interests in it. And such revisions may take many forms, and while specific suggestions may have been made to the student during a crit, specific advice given, the student's revisions are not limited to these, but they must respond in some way. That then is my account of how crits work when they do work. And before I go on, I should make some, I feel I should, in this context, make some philosophical reflections on the basis of this account. I've described how Alba's teaching methods relied on a kind of common sense in the group, and it will be apparent that something similar must be true of crits if they are going to work on the account I've given, or no convergence will be possible. How am I doing for time, Jenny? Okay. But why, when looking at contemporary art, should there be a consensus? Why should a series of subjective responses converge and overlap in the way that I've described? So there is no a priori reason why this should happen. We might well imagine, even expect, that a group of observers will respond in ways that generate no consensus at all. To be clear, consensus does not always occur in crits. And I would appeal to those of you who have, your own experience if you've been involved in them. I think you'll know that's the case. But I believe that consensus is always possible, and in a well-run crit, it will usually come about in some form. Traditionally in aesthetics, a consensus of taste can be reached because individuals possess a common, that is, again, a shared sense, the sensus communis. We share potentials of understanding and imagination that ensure that we have the capacity to respond in the same way to the same object. So this is the Kantian idea. I will not commit to that approach, but I do draw from it the idea that consensus relies on a common sense, a shared sense. For Immanuel Kant, the sensus communis is, quote, a power to judge that in reflecting takes account of everyone else's way of presenting, that is to say, way of apprehending something. And Kant thinks we do this in the following way. Again, quote, we compare our judgment not so much with the actual as with the merely possible judgments of others, and thus put ourselves in the position of everyone else. Of course, in a crit, one does not need to imagine or infer the possible responses of others, because the others are right there, furnishing actual responses. Group members can gauge their own capacity to respond as others do. So if someone says, you know, this has this effect on me, you can ask yourself, well, can I see it that way too? And idiosyncratic responses, outliers, if you like, can be identified and discounted. And in that process, a consensus can be established. So consensus does not require unanimity, but it requires a fairly stable centre, if you like. So here, the sensus communis finds a very literal basis in a community. In an important respect, I need to vary from Kant. What Kant calls the formal features that serve as the basis for his conception of the aesthetic may be of interest to the group. Beauty often is of interest still in art schools, but they are only likely to be one among many kinds of interest. And as I've said, I place no constraints on what these interests may be. So the group may find beauty interesting, but will likely find other qualities of contemporary art of value too. So broadly speaking, where a consensus emerges, I take it that it will depend on shared dispositions of perception and thought. Our perceptual capabilities are largely shared, I take it. We share roughly a common physiology, roughly a common psychology, and we share roughly a common environment, both physical, cultural, technological. I mean, perhaps I should be more exact about that. I don't mean to say that those things all coincide for us. We're all different in importance, you know, in important ways too, but there is a substantial area of overlap. So such facts allow a group, a community to respond, to see, feel, understand in ways that overlap, and so shape the interests that the students and group are collectively capable of taking in art. That is to say, they give an assurance that consensus is possible. Okay. According to both Elkins and Suter, crits favour the production of particular kinds of work and thereby have an influence on contemporary art. So Elkins holds that any fundamental change in teaching habits will also change our concept of art. Altered teaching would produce altered goals and ideals and a new critical language and a different mindset. So despite his pessimism about crits, he is clear that this goes for crits as much as any other form of art education. And Suter has a similar view. She says the qualities promoted by the structure of crits have, quote, firmly established themselves at the core of ambitious contemporary art. What qualities then do crits promote? How do they shape art? According to Suter, again, I think it's very insightful. Some kinds of art are better suited to this educational approach than others, that is, to crits. With a discursive, self-critical quality, work with a discursive, self-critical quality can yield complex, satisfying discussion, while work that is primarily intuitive or expressive in nature often leads the conversation back to the artist in a series of frustrating cul-de-sacs. But she goes on to propose that crits promote the following qualities. They encourage work that is, quote, able to generate a sustained discussion, work that has layers of meaning, of which appearance is only one, and work that does, she says, at least some of what its maker intended it to do, and work that has a certain responsibility to the interpretations that it generates. I take that last point to mean that the artist is aware of and in control of the responses that a sympathetic audience will have to it. Okay, I've got a page more. 2 minutes. I'll see how it goes. Okay. So I want to conclude by proposing a further influence of crits. That crits play a role in promoting a particular kind of concept of art. By a concept of art, I mean an idea of what quality or qualities optimize the value of art. Concepts of art are not descriptive, as definitions of art are intended to be, but normative. So, for instance, the concept of art held by an artist will guide them in their art making. In the past, most concepts of art have been quite restrictive. Restrictive concepts of art stipulate that art should have some or other quality that gives it value as art. So we can speak of a mimetic concept of art. We can speak of that requires, that guides artists towards lifelike representation. We can speak of an aesthetic concept of art. And one popular during the mid-20th century guided artists towards kind of aesthetic formalism, Greenbergian abstraction and so on. Now, crits discourage any such restrictive concepts of art. The range of interests that the crit group can form a consensus around is the only restricting, constraining feature on my account. And even this is not necessarily a restriction. For these two can change, at least to a degree as culture and technology change. For this reason, crits work against the imposition of restrictive concepts of art, whether it be mimetic, aesthetic, political, or anything else. As such, the art that comes out of crits can only be characterised according to what we can call a pluralistic concept of art, whereby pluralism I understand an acceptance of a plurality of artistic forms, media, kinds of content as potentially having value. Or as Arthur Danto pithily puts it, that with qualification, anything goes. One important qualification I'd add around here is about originality. Artists must do more than present interesting work. It must be original. An art student's work must also aspire to a measure of originality, otherwise it won't go very far in a crit. Okay, one last thought. On this basis, we can also hypothesise, I would also hypothesise that crits play a role in instilling such a pluralistic concept in art students, and so in maintaining and propagating pluralism in the contemporary art world. A range of artists, including arguably artists from Duchamp to the conceptualists, have adopted pluralistic concepts without the benefit of crits. And as I've mentioned, some art schools, notably those in continental Europe, seem to operate without this while still instilling this concept. But the dominance of pluralism in the international art world since roughly the 1970s, as Danto has talked about and described, also coincides with the establishments of crits in art schools in the UK, the US, and Australasia. It may be that this is more than coincidence. Perhaps the longevity that pluralism in contemporary art has exhibited since this time, we have had roughly half a century or 2 generations of it in the art world, and pluralism's global dominance today owe something to the use of crits in art schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that very clear and articulate presentation. Because you've given us something that's quite clearly stated, so that we know where to position ourselves in relation to what you're saying. Sometimes these discussions can be quite vague, so it's very hard to know where to begin. But that
Yeah.
Because if the group, if consensus just means that we all respect each other or tolerate differences, in order that we handle the plurality of conceptual files, it seems like then you don't have a genuine consensus on, you might say, a specific conception of it. You just sort of allow flowers to bloom wherever they bloom, but that's a very thin notion of consensus. It doesn't seem like the rich notion of sense community that you seem to be painting at the beginning. So it seems like you have to, in either to dial up the pluralism on the outside, going down what consensus means. That's how it seems.
Yeah, I think that's very nicely put, and I think it is a challenge. It's a challenge for this position. So yeah, as you say, consensus. As I've described it, it looks like it could be a limiting thing. It's just those few things that we can agree on. I think there is an empirical feature of this as well, of this project, that it's a matter of, though it has to work at a theoretical level too. So I think just at the empirical level, crits, they don't work like that when they run well. So people will discover a capacity for new kinds of responses, new kinds of interests they can have that they didn't have before. And I think that is the core to the kind of response, the kind of theoretical response too, that I would want to give. But it requires absolutely that consensus is not just those few things that we can agree on, but it involves an understanding and awareness that all kinds of things can have value to the viewer, even if maybe not to the individual artist.
Allow the art students to do a presentation on their work for credit. And the other students ask all sorts of questions, which ordinary members of the public ask about art, like why is that art and why is that banned from the choreography students? And the students are just stuck, they can't. And I think it's kind of like the way artists are when they can't explain what they're doing to members of the public. And there's these issues for members of the public finding art so shocking or so offensive, and all the kinds of scandals that have occurred. And so I wonder, could it be a way in which the narrowness of this kind of process and the exclusionariness of it contributes to art becoming more and more esoteric, less communicating less to a real community and only to the scope?
Yeah, the way I would see that issue is around the constitution of the group, and I think that certainly in practice the most effective crits, they have really significant, the major input from the students' peers rather than the teachers. That's usually the case. I guess there really is a question around, you can, in the US, they have these, I think it sounds like you've been involved with them. They will form a kind of jury where they assess of teachers and, visiting academics, artists, figures such as yourself. And, these are the experts. And I guess an implication there, and something I haven't really touched on in this talk, but it's really crucial, is that in that case, they represent the art world. That is what the school is trying to do. They're trying to draw in people, range of people, critics, curators, artists who represent the art world. So they give the judgment that will, roughly speaking, correspond to the art world. And for crits to be effective, for any kind of art school education to be effective, and this, is the same. This is the case going back hundreds of years too. The standards that are introduced in art school have to, roughly speaking, in some sense, line up with, overlap, ideally coincide with the criteria for judgment used by the art world at that time. Otherwise, what are you training? What are you training artists for? So there is a tension, which I don't want to disguise, between the group in one form or another, channeling the judgments of the art world as they perceive them, and on the account I've given, doing something that may happen to align with that, but may not, which is just exploring and developing their own interests. And I think it is the latter where crits work in clearly, I think, where they are most interesting and most effective. And it just happens that when that does work very well, the art world, it will align, roughly speaking, overlap with what the art world is interested in. And it may also come to influence, in the fullness of time, influence the art world as well. But I don't want to disguise that there are difficult tensions there.
About your appeal to historical thinking, so one about another one got done there. So Kant certainly is sitting on the idea that justification claims some kind of universal validity, but at the same time is very insistent that this is not to be determined empirically by, so to speak, counter votes from actual peers or audiences. It's an ideal argues that the young poet is right not to be swayed by any judgment of his peers. Although, at the same time, in some reflection, the young poet might realize that somebody has a good point, and that should be his work one way or another. But it's the consensus that he's seeking is that this ideal audience under optimal conditions, not and I'm wondering, so my first question is whether you see any room in the way these critical sessions are conducted for that, think about what is being said by peers or other teachers, but nevertheless has to retain its own critical evaluation of what is being said.
Yeah.
That's the one question. The other question was about the Dante and pluralism, and your suggestion that lies of pluralism and art may be connected regardless. And it seems to me that's not what Dante's argument suggests. Dante's argument is rather that certain, certain projects taken in various historical pieces, one project, the project undercut but several projects,
Yeah.
use art, wide scale, leaving the medium or writing media without a clearly predefined goal or use, and therefore leaving artists sort of perforce free to try to invent something of use for this
Yeah.
media. It's not particularly connected with educational practices. That might explain why you get the same
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I suppose, well, you've raised a lot of things. I think with Danto, I wouldn't want to commit to the whole narrative he gives around the development of contemporary art, which he describes, as we've said, as pluralistic. But I think his description of the final state is pretty much on the money, and so that's really what I'm using there. I think there is also there's a good question about how much these educational practices shape art, and how much the art prevailing art of the time shapes the educational practices. And clearly, the only sensible way of seeing that is that there's going to be a feedback loop. There will be an interrelation. In terms of Kant, yeah, let me think a moment. I think, perhaps this is a response that I suppose maybe addresses what some of you who have experience with art schools might be thinking, but I think there are certainly, it is a helpful thing to sometimes, if a crit's gone very badly, you're an art student, you've presented your work, you've got all kinds of bad responses to it. Very often that happens for good reason, because your work needs to be revised. You do need to reassess it. But sometimes that's not the case. I think critic groups, they're utterly human. They can get things wrong. We all get judgments wrong individually, and it can happen under certain situations that, of course, groups can get things wrong too. Sometimes millions upon millions of people. And I think what I would say to the art student in that circumstance, who has had a bad crit, but they've missed out on having aspects of their work addressed which should be fostered, which are of value, which do need some kind of support and development. In those cases, it does help to ask oneself, well, what would an ideal group have looked like? If it weren't these bunch of people looking at my work, but a group of people who had different kinds of knowledge, maybe better kinds of knowledge about certain things, maybe too had different kinds of temperaments and interactions, just at a kind of conversational, personal level. How would things have gone? And I think at a certain point, when art students have experience with this way of working, it can be helpful to think in those terms. It can be a bit risky too, because if you're a terrible art student and you go into every crit, come out of every crit thinking, those people, they know nothing. It happens every time. The odds are that the ideal crit group would come to precisely the same response. But I've certainly seen examples myself where I think things could have gone better. Really striking examples too.
Now, we're running out of time, and we want to keep time. I know I have two more philosophy questions, but it would be good to hear from somebody who's just an artist, or somebody that's going to get our impression from a slightly different angle. Was there somebody else I missed? If not, we'll go to the last two questions. So no one else wants to ask a question? Say the artist. Okay. But we need to keep these questions open.
So just like the first question, I find myself sort of wanting to know more about what kind of consensus you have in mind. I don't think it would depend on what kind of discussion went on. So is it open-ended, is it rule-based, is it coercive, is it emotional, and so on. I don't actually imagine people make a lot of generalizations. So could you say a little bit more
Yeah.
about what kind of consensus, or good consensus, would be
Yeah.
good group would come up?
Yeah. I think there has to be there has to, as I said at the outset, a real freedom of response, but these have to be also, the group members need to consider their capacity to have the responses that others are having as well, that others are describing. I think without that, it's very hard to build a consensus. But aside from that, it is it is almost something like a show of hands. Who can see this kind of who can respond to this work in this kind of way. Then who do we see this as a valuable kind of quality for art to have? Does that answer your question?
It was not that extremely generic
Mm.
question.
What do you have in mind?
Did you say, can you respond to this? Sure.
Well, I should say, something like I think there never is a show of hands in crits, but there is a sense, you can get a sense of a groundswell of consensus, I think, or a groundswell, which may also be is often a dissatisfaction with some aspect of the work that seems to be problematic, but. I think there are no, there are no rules. There just is no kind of rule book around this kind of teaching. But I think if it is going to work, it has to be, a genuine and fairly substantial overlap of opinion. But I don't think I would not want to say more than that. I'm not sure I'll be able to say more than that. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think I'll be. Certainly, I think crits. They do encourage work that has multiple layers of meaning, if you like. That's the way it's more often put in the art world. So much so that it's a bit of a cliche work that has a range of valences. In terms of pluralism, I'm very pleased you brought that up because, for a couple of reasons. I think one, let's say, let me take. I'll make 2 points here. So one is that pluralism. I think Danto is right in that it just describes the art world as it currently is and how it has been for decades now. Now, maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe it is a good thing. Maybe 1,000 flowers, 1,000,000 flowers blooming, whatever, decade after decade. Maybe this is, a wonderful kind of utopia, or maybe it's not. It is, however, how things are in the art world. And as I've already said, I think you need, clearly no form of art teaching, of art training is, historically now is going to be much good unless, at least among other things, it trains its students to prosper in whatever shape the contemporary art world happens to have at the time. And I think crits do that. So you might criticise pluralism, but I think that's more criticism of the state of the contemporary art world rather than crits per se. The second point I'd make here is that pluralism is actually a contentious idea. There are lots of people in the art world who, if you mention pluralism, if there's a whiff of pluralism, they will very quickly go on the offensive. This is especially the case with artists, theorists, art historians who think that art should have, if you like, it should have a much more focused approach. It shouldn't be, their criticism is that pluralism ultimately is a creature of the market, usually, and art needs to have a kind of political, social awareness and critical quality and really a social and political mission at some theoretical, practical, maybe activist level. And I'm inclined to think that, for those in the art world who take that position, that crits are actually not a good form of teaching. Crits promote this quality in art, pluralism, that really does tend to eat away at a very focused political art. If you want to learn political art, I think it would be better to go and study with, a great artist, contemporary artist working in that tradition. Absorb their ideas, experiment with new, very focused ideas around, their particular approach, rather than potentially, getting lost in this world of pluralism. It's to put the pluralist, to give another kind of view of things. So I think there are complexities around. There are interesting, important complexities around this.
We might revisit pluralism at the very end of the day. We might have more things to say about it, but perhaps we should break for dinner.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. We thought we'd just go through, it's going to be quite a personal presentation as the...
We'll be looking at where a lot of our source or our ideas kind of come from.
So I guess as the artists of this, we'll be talking about how we make artwork and what we think about when we're making artwork and what kind of structures kind of create the artwork that we create in a sense. So we thought it was kind of fun in this, because it's an art philosophy situation. Some people here are just into the general area. Some people are philosophers here, some people are artists, and I think it's a common thing. Like if you meet someone and you say, "Oh, what do you do?" and you say, "Well, I'm an artist," or "What do you do?" "I'm a philosopher." I think the general perception can be quite strange. What does a philosopher actually do? Do you sit at home in a toga and like think about things very deeply? It's a similar. Why not? Like, it's
but
a similar.
As an artist, often as soon as you mention an artist, it'll be, so what kind of painting do you do?
So yeah, do you do landscapes or do you do portraits? So maybe that's a very Australian thing. But I thought, well, a lot of our work is, we live in an internet age, so if you type in artist, this is like about the number 5 or so within a Google search if you type in like an artist. So it's is this a good representation of how artists operate, and what kind of tensions are there or whatever? Okay.
So here we have an image of the classic kind of lone and tortured artist, perhaps.
I guess our artwork is a little bit different in that we have a collaborative practice.
Yeah, so a lot of work for the typical artist might come as a very naive kind of response to something, or something that's quite deeply subconscious. But as a collaborative duo, we find that we always have to bring our ideas to a verbal level, which, you know, is a different way of working.
In that sense, like, a lot of art can be intuitive, or you can just go, if you're an artist, you can be in your own head. But at a very early stage when we make art, we have to talk about it. And it's interesting being in this situation. The thing that we like about art is that it is not a linear progression. And I guess having to do this presentation, we're going along this linear thing. We're not writers, so we don't usually have to work on a linear kind of this goes to this goes to this. And I guess, like, in art, we often think about art in terms of like food or whatever, I guess, and thinking in a linear fashion is like, if you can imagine a bowl of spaghetti bolognese and it's just one spaghetti and you're just like going through it, and then like I got a bit of meat and I got a bit of tomato and then I have a bit of meat or something. Whereas like art is like you just put your fork in it and you jam it, and it could be anywhere, you just go into it, and so let's go.
So here we have a Picasso.
This is a painter. He uses his penis to paint with, and we just thought we'd come up with this idea in thinking about, because there's a lot of not only thinking about artwork is when I think about art, I think about food, but I also think about there's a lot of art that's also about sex in a way too, and the idea of inspiration. People talk about, people who don't make art often talk a lot about inspiration, and artists don't really talk a lot about inspiration a lot. And okay. So the idea that like you have this inspiration and then suddenly you make an artwork. The other day I was in a taxi and we were having a conversation, and then he said, "Oh, so you're an artist? So like, when you're upset, do you just like start drawing or something like that?" And I was like, "Not exactly." So. But I think that's a common perception, that it's a very kind of, I'm sure a lot of artists do work like that, but it's not as quick. It's not like, oh, you meet someone and bam, you're having sex kind of thing. It's like it's kind of much more, when I think about contemporary art, I think more about like schmutziger Spiel or something like that, where there's so much, it's not like an immediate thing. It's like the level of process is quite intense. It's like, you know, getting up in a rubber suit and all this kind of other business to just get to the end point.
So fortunately for both Sean and I, we've been trained under the same lecturers who went to university together. So I think collaboration for us is a very natural and easy thing, because I think we have a very similar understanding of, you know, aesthetic. Although our ideas are vastly different, we often come to the table with very different beginning points or ideas. But when it comes to a way something will then be portrayed or executed, we have very similar vision.
So we thought we'd just go through several projects that we have done over the years, and how they started and then where they kind of ended up. So this first one we're going to talk about, so there's not going to be any kind of big conclusion at the end. We just thought we'd just go through things in different scenarios and how they play out. So
a lot of our projects might even be like, well, this one particularly is about the Challenger disaster from 1986, and we were chosen to participate in a residency in Japan, in Akiyoshidai, and on the island of Honshu. And so this is the place we had 10 weeks to create a body of work. And so in this instance, we had to put up a proposal, what the idea would be. And in this kind of situation, we needed to hit the ground running to be able to just make a body of work. So before we got there, we organised all our materials and had them ready to go.
So you can see it's a pretty remote place. Being there was quite similar to being like in The Shining, really. It was very remote, and we had no transport, and we had to. It's a strange thing because like it's a thing where a residency, you can imagine like you're supposed to be taking in information, and that will influence the artwork that you make. But it's a little bit backwards because you have, in this instance, like we proposed a project and then they said yes to it and then we carried it out. So it's this kind of funny. And then, so what we were hoping is that like through the project that we were making, we could somehow gain a kind of understanding, a Japanese perspective of what we were doing.
Yeah, so it's, for us, what could we possibly bring to Japan? It's a bit much to, make something that's site-specific, when perhaps we don't have the knowledge that, well, not necessarily that, but just to be able to be, ready to...
I think it's one of those things, it's like, well, do you really want to bring coal to Newcastle? Like what, as an artist, do you have to be like, oh, I'm really Japanesey, or is it like, do they want to know something else? And what do we know about when you're not from a culture, and like, what do you know of it? There's always like these kind of cliches or that inform us. And so we were thinking, oh, what's exciting about Japan? And we're like, oh, what about of course, the idea of seppuku or harakiri is always like, as a kid, it's like, oh yeah, it's like a really kind of amazing thing. And then I guess we were, we came up with two quotes that we got. One from the Hagekure, the way the samurai. I'll just read this out to you. We all want to live, and in a large part, we make our logic according to what we like, but not having attained our aim and continuing to live in cowardice. This is a thin, dangerous line. To live without gaining one's aim is a dog's death and fanaticism, and there is no shame in this. This is the substance of the way of the samurai. So we went with this idea of the dog's death, and also a quote we found from Paul Virilio, the integral accident. To invent the sailing ship or steamer is to invent the shipwreck. To invent the train is to invent the rail accident of derailment. To invent the family automobile is to produce the pile-up on the highway. To get what is heavier than air to take off in the form of an aeroplane or dirigible is to invent the crash, the air disaster. So, although it's quite a dark space to begin with, a body of work, we started thinking, back to childhood things, like something like space travel is something that really captures the imagination. And I guess science fiction does, or science, this kind of exploration does go through a bit of our work. So, although there's a darkness to that idea of with the invention, say the invention of the spaceship, there's also the invention of without the Challenger disaster or whatever. But thinking about an object like Lego also has this intrinsic within it, the idea that you can create something and something can also be destroyed. And we use that as our launch pad, so to speak.
Yeah, so we went with this idea of something that we were deeply affected by when, within our own generation, the Challenger disaster. It was something that was televised as a live event, across the world, globally on TV. And so we decided it was interesting that this was the first time that a civilian had been able to get into space and conduct what was going to be the first classroom in space, called Where Are We Going? What was it?
Who we are,
where we've been, why. Yeah.
So Krista McAuliffe was chosen as the first in space, and I guess it was not only a tragic event, but it was a very televisual event. It was really going to be broadcast to the masses, and the imagery from it really was quite intense and really burnt into our minds as children.
Yeah, so we thought that we would try and build this event in the numerous photography that we had managed to just trawl the internet and found, these images that are accessible to us now. But at the time, it was quite a shocking thing for us to see this take place, so that, you know, it was a disaster that, yeah, it was quite, well, I mean, it had such an effect on us. And so we've chosen the Lego brick as well to portray this disaster because of the way that the pixelation of the TV screen of that time, you know, rendered itself. And so you'll see the images of the work, which is inspired by older work of yours.
I'll just go back. So we had quite a clear thing that we wanted to do, but I guess through the making the work, we really wanted to find out whether there was a kind of a Japanese take on it, whether the idea of the dog's death and the idea of Krista McAuliffe setting out to attain this goal, but ultimately failing, but was there still some kind of honor within that or something? I think we failed to actually get much of a response, but it was basically the beginning of. So this is the technique that we decided to use of representation. This is Paris Hilton in made out of Lego. It was an early work. We just used regular Lego bricks using these colors, and then very nuts and bolts boring, we sorted them out and within our studio, and then we put the images together. So we reduced the palette of each image and then created these works.
So I guess the whole body of work becomes a meditation of time, because each of these images are, you know, moments after the time of takeoff.
I guess the thing about this work also, there's a level of vampirism that is difficult to navigate. The idea of, you know, focusing on these kind of disasters, but there's also a level of commemoration too, and that we thought there was to it too.
But also, in a sense, celebration, you know, like to be able to get to this level of expertise, you know, for these astronauts to have this opportunity to go up into space, you know, to die at that point of, like, you know, is quite a celebration as well as a commemoration.
So some of the works were more abstract than others, and some of them were quite straight up. I'll just flick through. I think that's the end.
Yeah.
So we'll move on to the next body of work. We didn't paint this. And
so the next body of work is called Prems. It was a project we did in Lyon in France, and we wanted to work with the notion of the idea of ownership.
So we were invited by a gallery called Labief 15, and the gallery is actually named after a potato, a certain type of potato that's used a lot in France. And we decided we wanted to think about, we had like a 10-day install period, and we wanted to make a work that was looking at the relationship between representation and ownership.
So the word prems actually in French is similar to the word bags or dibs. It's like, you know, claiming ownership on something like a car seat or something that's like maybe a public thing, but somehow notionally you might be able to claim that thing just by kind of bagsing it.
So we began with this mysterious image that was found on the internet in the advent of Google Earth. People would just trawl around Google Earth and just look for things. And this site was found by a German.
His name was Ken, under the pseudonym Ken Grock, in 2007. He discovered this area, which is actually a model of a place in China called Aksai Chin.
So it's interesting that you can see that the space in it is totally different to the space around it, and people were calling it China's Area 57. And it's an interesting space in that it's a scale model of Aksai Chin, which is where China had a war with India back
in 1972.
So you can basically, it was that bit there. So it's basically a strange 1 to 500 model of that space. And we thought that was very interesting in terms of thinking of representation and ownership and how that plays out. Like if you just represent something, does that mean that you own it, as in prems or bags? Can you bags it? And we were thinking about this happening on an international political scale.
Yeah, it's quite a mystery, really, like why this area is, was located on Google Earth and is 500 to 1. And so with this idea, we thought we'd like to kind of discover or kind of figure out that mystery a little bit more by making a model ourselves of this model. But the model that we would make would be a transportable version.
Sorry about that.
So this is an installation and I guess a topographic impression of the model of that particular area.
So again, we've gone back to Lego and we're thinking about this idea of, in a sense, it's almost a war game, I guess, and thinking of, through the representation, we can own this. And even something like Google Earth in itself is a kind of ownership. If they've mapped out the whole world and this idea that you can see everything, you can know everything that's going on.
Yeah, so each of these little components of terrain are placed on top of a postal box, which is, something you'd recognise easily, I guess, being French. So on the back wall, that's a pinboard drawing or wall work, really made out of drawing pins of the Google Earth satellite. Is it Worldview? So yeah, we were using drawing pins, thinking about the idea of warfare and claiming of land and hot spots, and so taking that aesthetic of the drawing pin into these other versions of other works. And
this is also part of the installation, but it's a work within itself. It's another drawing pin work. It's called the 7 Ps. And within military jargon, it's perfect practice and preparation prevents piss poor performance. And it's a way that military people carry out their business.
So now we'll continue on with the next project called Venereal Architecture. And similarly to Lego, which is, an aspirational tool for children, we thought we'd, utilise, which we have done with other works in the past, IKEA furniture, which I guess is kind of like the adult version of what Lego is.
So in a sense, this is a similar situation again. We were on a year-long residency in Kuala Lumpur in a place called Rimbundahan, and we knew we were going to be in that place for a year, and we wanted to make a body of work that we could just kind of work on. And I guess it's a similar situation to the Challenger work in that it's basically one idea and then a riff, just riffing on that, the way that comes together. So we've always been interested in IKEA in the sense of, I guess marketing people talk about like the lizard brain and how we can talk to the lizard brain and get people to buy things and stuff like that. And then there's something very kind of caveman or something about IKEA. You go there and then you get it, you get the thing, and then you can have a hot dog afterwards. Or
it's almost like a hunter-gatherer experience where you just like slowly culling or collecting things within your trolley, putting them into
something very nesting, and there's something.
You'll see couples, happily in love, dreaming of their
world they're going to create.
Domestic surroundings.
So this idea is just you go in there and then there's something, it's interesting that it's like this analog, you could go in there, you feel like you're a carpenter, you put this together and you made this furniture, or you made this meatball or whatever. And there's something very primal about the experience, people coming together, but there's also something, it's a strange thing because there's this kind of primal experience, but then also a very kind of commercial thing. And we were thinking about that meeting of Nate. I know it's a very...
Well, maybe like just for us being in an exotic kind of situation in Kuala Lumpur, here we were in the middle of the jungle, and nature was a very evident and visible and all-encompassing, overwhelming thing.
Yeah, basically, it's so humid, if you don't move, things will start to grow on you. Like we went on holidays and switched off the fans in our place, and we came back and there was just like a plume of mold over everything just after 10 days or something. So it's really, you can feel the environment just coming in. And I guess like Australia is very desiccating. You can feel that environment. It's like everything gets so dry, and it's just the opposite. So we're thinking about this meeting point where things just kind of like grow
well,
into
I think,
each other.
as humans, we tend to think that we can control our immediate environment. We're forever manipulating and tweaking the temperature, just so that we can be comfortable if we wear clothing, if we control it by air conditioning. But in a sense, like we're realizing now that our environment is actually probably far more powerful in the way it can control us and define what we do, in a lot of catastrophic and natural disasters that have happened of late.
So we're thinking about our life and how these things just carry on through. This meeting point is similar. We're trying to think of not just in terms of like a conceptually, but just like a feeling. And we're thinking about ectoplasm and how these early spirit photography, how these shapes just manifest
in places that you wouldn't expect them to. So this very early, late 19th century hoax, or maybe it wasn't hoax photography, had all these kind of, we were interested in Eva C, and some of the photographs that came of that time with these spirits coming from particular orifices. So we decided to build these wild animals. We had already assembled our IKEA pieces of furnishings and then built these animals and kind of as if they had been pinned by the furnishings, kind of like an entomologist, placing a pin through a beetle on a board.
But also the idea of just two objects occupying the same space at one time, and how our relationship.
In a very uncanny kind of situation.
So I just put that in because it's a similar color palette. So we'll just scroll through the works that came of it. So in a sense, there was two components to this. There was the animals and the furnishings, and then we also had yeah.
We'll move to the next.
Okay. There were some wall works that were based upon a thing called Not Another IKEA Catalogue. And there was...
yeah. So these images are also sourced from an online catalogue, which were pornography images, but had used the sets were made out of IKEA furniture.
So someone had just basically trawled through porno videos and found pieces of IKEA within videos, and then they made like a catalogue. I would have shown you, but they're all pretty graphic.
We thought that just went along with the idea of the base kind of instinctual and hunter-gatherer couple nesting.
Okay, we have maybe room for one more project.
Do you want to talk about?
We'll just go through this quick, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we just wanted to start this off with the idea of William Burroughs' Language is a Virus from Outer Space. The beginning of this show, this is a show that we put on in Gallery Gitteweiser in Berlin, and we thought we wanted to think about non-verbal communication. This is from the Pioneer Space Park.
And so, yeah, it was made by Carl Sagan and Dr. Frank Drake and Linda Saltzman-Sagan in 1972. And they were given like 3 weeks to come up or conceive of an idea that wasn't using a language or a culturally kind of significant way of conveying a message to
aliens, basically. So this plaque was put on the Pioneer space probe, and it's basically an intergalactic message in a bottle. It depicts like where we live. It depicts who we are. It's supposed to represent the hydrogen atom in its normal and excited state, and through that you can extrapolate distances from the nearest pulsars, where our solar system is, and where we are within the solar system. Within there, you can see the size of the Pioneer space probe, and then the size of human beings next to the space probe. But we thought about this in relation to this idea, a flawed idea of non-verbal communication, and we thought that it was quite a similar project to how IKEA tries to create this too.
Yeah, within the IKEA manual of erecting a piece of furniture. So we thought we'd riff along both of these ideas of communication.
Sorry, this is a pretty random shot. But so this is basically our idea of what the future should be like, and then what our future is. And we were thinking about, there's a quote which is lost, but the idea that you can basically, using your thumb, you can basically eliminate the Earth when you're standing on the moon.
But I think for astronauts, it must be an incredibly isolating and lonely kind of space to be, especially on the other side of the moon when there is, well, at this point, there was no communication between the Earth and the capsule. So that point of like total isolation and just, yeah, I guess we were thinking of
modern day consumerism. So this is a lac table that we've pulped. The lac table is one of the most popular products you can buy, and we basically pulp the table to create these kind of spheres. We've got 1 minute.
Okay.
We'll just click through this. So we're thinking about the idea of what we thought our future could be, and then this kind of not internalization, but what it really became. The idea of how...
And also looking at like the aesthetic of Piet Mondrian and...
How does steel transformed into something very banal, and... Anyway, let's just go through these quickly.
So pretty much we've etched into the surface of the melamine surface, exposing the, incredibly
rich and beautiful MDF.
That golden chipboard beneath the surface.
This is from the Voyager space probe when they created the sounds of the Earth. And we put both sides of that and we played it together too. And we were thinking about just the idea of that lonely space probe exiting the solar system, and thinking about that in terms of, it was kind of like Hansel and Gretel just out into the beyond. And so we got the plaque and we etched that onto Kanakabrot.
Which is also an IKEA product.
Oh, So I think we'll stop it at there. And,
Yeah, we have another project that continues on the theme of space, but yeah, we'll leave it at that.
This time, just to help the filmmaker catch the questions. Any questions? I'd like to start out then by asking you of cases where you feel that the way people have responded to you, whether they're just friends or critics or people in galleries or wherever, professionals or non-professionals, where you felt they've misunderstood you or got the wrong idea of the work. Could you give us an
I don't
example?
think that's really an issue. Well, for me, I feel like sometimes it's really important for other people to have their fresh eyes onto what it is we do, because I think it's really important, like that other people can bring other information, like in the previous talk that we heard about, like the idea of the crit and like perhaps a student not really being aware of certain things. I think that's a nice thing. We all exist in the same kind of time together, and there's things that we're all exposed to as humans, and I think there's other stuff that we can learn from others.
I think the way that we set up this talk, I guess we had quite specific things that we were thinking about when we made the works, but that's really just our personal thing that drove us to make the work. But once the work's there, how can you say anybody's response to it is really correct or incorrect? I mean, maybe it could be incorrect in that we haven't expressed ourselves properly or whatever, but you can't really say to someone, oh, that's not the right thing to think, because that's basically just what they're bringing to the work. And if you don't bring something of your own to the work, then there's no real relationship with the work.
That's interesting. So when people are discussing the work, which they do, because there's so much to talk about, there is a sense that they're trying to get something right, because otherwise they wouldn't bother talking to each other about it. So a lot of people have a really perspective to you, and then you think, oh, how did that? And so you want to hear what it is, so just in case you've actually totally missed something. So there is always a sense of trying to get something right. And sometimes, you see that another person has a really interesting perspective, but you still feel committed to your view. You still think, oh, no, I think the way I'm looking at it actually makes the work more significant. So it just seems, it's a point of view that I think I'd still want to defend. So, yeah, that's I've got more to say about that, and this goes back to the idea of a sort of procedural pluralism. But Moen, did you want to come in on that?
I actually wanted to follow up on exactly what I wanted to follow up on exactly what Jenny was talking about, because the one big incongruity in your presentation for me was the Aksai Chin part of it. And it just seemed to me I couldn't get my mind around that at all, because Aksai Chin means so many things to me, and none of those things includes what you made of it. And I just don't know how to cope with that presentation of that topic.
Maybe it was just a failure then. I mean,
No, I mean, but that's the way we approach it.
But I mean,
maybe failure on our part to communicate. So, because of course, like, I guess for our generation, like the Sino-Indian War it's for us. It was before I was born, so it's kind of quite a conceptual kind of thing. But for others, it was a real thing. I guess we came at it from a more kind of,
for us, it is such a mystery that this model exists, and it was, located through Google Earth and discovered through Google Earth, and we found that the fascinating part of this, and I guess that's how we. At the time we were living in Germany, and a lot of our work of that time was really influenced by our personal situation constantly moving. And yeah, I think we were, you know, looking at the way things are transported globally, whether it be through imagery, like via internet, or physical kind of, you know, components. Like we were considering posting each of those parts of that landscape through the post, but that didn't work.
I think, yeah, I mean, maybe the work was just not. I mean, on one side, maybe the work was just not that successful. Maybe you saw in the world, I don't really get what you're trying to say doesn't really compute with what I'm reading, and I think that happens. I think.
Well, my reaction doesn't prove that, right? I mean, it's just that it's just picking up on what Jenny said. It just seemed as if of all the reactions that somebody could have, that wouldn't have been one that I would understand.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk and I loved seeing your work. I have a question. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the use of Lego, because as you already mentioned, Lego is, well, it's a children's toy, but on the other hand, you have a lot of, gonna call them aficionados, using Lego to make intricate designs or scaled models of Big Ben or the Death Star or a statue of Katy Perry. So that seems to associate the medium with a kind of realm of kitsch. So it seems that Lego is like either seen as a toy or maybe like associated with these kind of kitsch uses of the medium. So yeah, could you tell more about how you negotiate the kind of association that people have with Lego? Or
Yeah, I don't think for better or for worse, I don't really think of the word kitsch, really.
I guess we use it in a lot of our past work has looked at the idea of destruction and reconstruction. So, for instance, we've, you know, pulled apart houses and cars and aeroplanes, and we're forever using the ready-made. And so the Lego brick, in a sense, is well, a number of times has been the ideal medium to use to represent.
Because I think I guess the idea of, if you think about Lego art, it's usually pretty awful. It's the worst kind of art you could. There's always like some guy ripping apart his chest, and there's like Lego spilling out of it, or there's a giant hand, or something. It's pretty bad, and
some people love that.
Yeah, but say why not just take it on? And it's like IKEA furniture, really. It's like,
but I guess for us as well, it's something that we've grown up with. It's again a generational thing. It's a toy that we like, you know, just loved and still love as an adult.
I guess, and we're also, the way we work, we try to communicate with people, and we try to tap into universal experiences and as middle class people or whatever, and using this kind of language is one of the ways we do that. Right.
And so for that project, the Challenger project, we thought it was being able to represent the idea of the pixelated image, the image that is brought to us via the television. We thought that it was an appropriate way to use Lego in that instance. And then with venereal architecture, with the animals, they were meant to be these kind of uncanny manifestations of, you know, forms that exist in spaces you wouldn't expect them to exist.
yeah, thank you.
Hi, I love the Challenger stuff. So just coming from a writer's point of view, I guess I'm working on what both you were saying. I love the artist statements. When I go to a gallery and I look at art, you know, it adds so much to the artwork for me. But I see it's kind of problematic. I would imagine it's a bit problematic coming from a visual artist's point of view, because you sort of limiting interpretation, and that must be such a large part of what you want your audience to get is an interpretation of what you're doing. So just, I've always been curious what artists think about the artist statements.
It's funny because, I mean, like, artist statement isn't always like the end point. So often it has to begin with some kind of funny artist statement, like, and then.
Well, it's another form of language, really, that we're not as, well, I feel, as good at as, you know, maybe the visual language we use to try to convey, you know, information. So when it comes to, you know, having something put into words, I find it very difficult because it strips away like the naive or something that, you know, has a certain presence or something that, you know, is very emotional. You know, audience might feel something that's very, you know, powerful, but there's no way of being able to express that in words.
I think it's a funny thing. It's just one of those weird things where it's not really your primary skill, but you have to be able to do it. It's like, I don't know, being able to do your tax or anything like that. I mean, why do you have to be so good at doing a spreadsheet or whatever? Like, does an accountant have to sing? Or what? Like, why is it that just because you do this job, you have to be able to do some other, because I'm a visual artist, does that mean that I have to be able to speak about it in words too? And I think
it becomes a different thing again, really.
Chris?
Yeah, I can see how there are lots of ways of understanding what you're doing, and that may well be different from the way in which you yourselves understand what you're doing. But is there no way in which someone could misunderstand you? And if so, what are the parameters of that?
I mean, of course people can misunderstand us. I mean, what our intention was, but
it happens all the time, and I quite enjoy it. I actually love it when, you know, people don't know, as an artist, you know, you don't really have a face to the work you do, and so sometimes if you're just like observing or as an audience member, just like, you know, in the gallery, perhaps being near your work and you hear people's responses to the work, I think it can be the most wonderful thing just to be exposed to this, you know, information that maybe wouldn't even be said to you as an artist, but to be able to, you know, eavesdrop in a sense. I think it's great, you know, to be able to be exposed to that, and also that, you know, feeds into maybe the next project.
I think the only time it's maybe an issue is if there's also, with any culture, like there's always this level of, sometimes people really get off on indignation. They see something and they go, oh, you know, it's about this, and I'm so indignant that it's about this, and you're totally wrong kind of thing. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess that's the only situation where I sort of go, well, that's not really what I was trying to talk about, or whatever. When people start to get on a high horse about some kind of thing, and it's like, well, I'm not talking about that, or whatever. Like, I think people often like to riff on that. I don't know.
One more question before we break for another coffee.
Claire and Sean, what was the response of viewers to the work shown at the gallery in Lyon, given France's long colonial history and the enduring legacy of that history?
Well, it's really hard to know. I mean, we were there for 10 days to make the work, and then had to leave once we had completed it. There was quite a bit of publicity, or there was quite a bit of press that was in French, and I think...
I don't know. I think it's interesting because it is the basis is very kind of colonial work,
yeah,
but it wasn't really, and I guess especially in Australia we have that. I guess more in New Zealand probably is more. You get that real sense of colonialism in terms of nuclear, the rainbow wire and things like nuclear testing in the atolls and stuff. But we didn't really come up on the radar, to tell you the truth, which was strange.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for holding out till the end of the session. I won't be, you know, annoyed if you leave halfway through. I was looking at the owl before. Is that owl doing an eye roll? I don't know. I mean, it will be by the end of this anyway. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna, Boandik and Bangata peoples as the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered. Which mic? All of them? Oh, you can't hear? Okay. Better? Okay, I'll try and project as well as speaking to the mic. I would also like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land my practice is mostly based, back in Melbourne. And I also extend that acknowledgement and respect to their elders, past, present, and future. So that acknowledgement to country is a kind of narrative, and it recognises a continuum of presence and unceded ownership, a connection and custodial care which is ongoing. And this narrative is fitting to me as a starting point for this short talk on what narratives offer and what importance, the importance of who owns them. So as I think Sean and Claire alluded to as well, that when artists speak in a forum such as this, or indeed in any other kind of forum, it's often at an order of remove from their default mode of expressive work. Words are not always at the service of the artist's interests, and presenting these words can even be antithetical to their project, if indeed they have a kind of a project. So in that vein, please do take these words as words in progress. So I'm going to start with something visual. Let's see if this works. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk after this. Let's watch this first. This goes for about a minute. It might be familiar to some of you. Sound up a second. He goes full Donald Trump at the end. So I'm not sure who's familiar with that short animation, but it was one that I sort of came across as a student in art school many years ago. And it interests me because of what it demonstrates is just how easy it is to derive narrative from a situation that involves dynamic characters. Things that move instantly seem to ascribe, we can ascribe agency to them, we ascribe meaning to their actions, and we derive that in a situation which is really just a series of shapes moving around a space. One YouTube commenter very aptly and rightly pointed out that we don't seem to ascribe that, to the big rectangle. What about the rectangle? And that's the rectangle that actually interests me mostly in my practice. So the rectangle in that space, in that video, is the kind of space of the gallery to me. It's the thing that doesn't move, that we forget is actually there, and that's shaping all this kind of interaction, that's making us be the agents we think we can be in that space. And so that's a kind of underpinning of some of my work, is thinking about the gallery context and thinking about the kind of, I guess, inbuilt narrative that we're subject to as soon as we step into the gallery frame, as it were. There's another one which interests me. Again, this may be familiar to some of you, so I apologize if it's pulling out my pop psychology things. It's my upbringing. So one of these is called Booba, and one of these is called Kiki. I'm not sure which ones you would describe it to, but maybe it's this way around. Would there be consensus, Michael, on this one? I don't know. Or would it be perhaps that way around? Okay, that's generally the way it goes. Around 98% of people from diverse language groups ascribe the same, they assign the same name to the same shape. And so that it can be used to think about the relationship to language and sonic properties. Also the visual overlap. Look at the Ks, look at the sharp Ks and kiki, and the round Bs and booba. You know, it's a really interesting proposition that right from the get-go, we are already aligning ourselves to a kind of a reading without much going on. There's just story, we just take it as given. This particular version is based on V.S. Ramachandran's reworking of an earlier work by Wolfgang Kohler, who was done in a Spanish-speaking country originally. But it's a very interesting thing to me, and it sort of points out the fact that narrative sort of surrounds us, and that we are in the world, and that as we are in the world, we begin and proceed on the basis of narrative, whether we like it or not. This quote by Kentridge, I think, also bridges some of that idea that there is something of that acknowledgement, I think, in artists' practice in the studio and the way they work, and how they are, I guess, understanding that their role in image making and making work is somehow about forming these connections that the viewer or the audience is going to make later on. Sometimes we do get it wrong, and sometimes we get it right. But this idea of coherence, and that there are fragments, and that we bring together some of these fragments, is something I think a lot of artists would understand about the studio process, and that you find yourself in the studio situation making something out of nothing, or recombining things, breaking something down, pulling it back together again, as Claire and Sean described it. So I'm going to start with the art school experience, because to me some of that narrative underpinning is started in the art school. I was really interested in Michael's talk, because I had to hold myself back from some of the things, because I am going to talk about crits as part of this scenario. So I'm an artist first, but I also teach in art schools and have had a regular job, let's say, for the last 5 years at Monash Art Design and Architecture. And I teach into the undergraduate program. I coordinate the BFA program there, also teach postgrad, supervise students in that space as well. And I guess I've been sort of teaching on and off in various ways for many, many years, not just at Monash. Over that time, I've seen a whole range of different kinds of students, but you can kind of break down ways of working in the studio, or ways of being an artist, into quite distinct patterns. And these are just 3 of them. These are not everything. But to me, these are just my sketches, so that you forgive their. You can see I didn't do that well in drawing. The first one is an interesting one. So you often get a student who might have an idea, and they believe in it so strongly, they think it's so clearly self-evident that it's going to just be imminently doable. They just go ahead and do it. And I've called that one an execution, because while they may get it up and running, they also kind of kill it along the way. They don't do anything to really explore the idea. The second one is more readily an artist in the world. They find a way to explore something, they can recognize a dead end, and then change tack. And it doesn't mean the idea doesn't sort of progress or change over the time. It just develops, and that part of that development is cutting off things. It might be realizing it, no, it can't be done in this way, I'm going to do it another way. Some of those things are material concerns, some of them are conceptual concerns as the idea gets formed. And the last one is, you might have no ideas, or you might have too many, and they're actually kind of a similar problem in a way. You don't know where to begin. And so you have to just start by doing something, and it's more like a cloud of activity that emerges. And out of that is something you might then arrive at, but it's this cloud-like space that is indeterminate and quite amorphous, gaseous. You can't sort of say exactly what's going into the work. It's a whole range of different things at once. And I can recognize myself in kind of combinations of all of those things and many others at various different times, and I think that's also important for artists, and particularly at art school mode, to be able to recognize what stage you might be in at any one time. And so how do we do that? So one of the things we ask students to do often is to write work proposals. I haven't been doing it for the last couple of years, and for reasons I'll outline now. The work proposal can be all kinds of things, but in a way it sort of cuts through to being partly an artist statement, so identifying your ideas and what your concerns are in the world, and also outlines what somebody's actually going to do over that semester. So you're asking that third year students, usually this is third year we're asking them to do this, you're asking them to articulate in their words what they are going to make and why they're going to make it and how they're going to make it. This student has a very artistic approach to that, and it's kind of more like the way artists think. It's sort of a whole collection of things, the lines that draw together. She states her interests as just interests. She's not declaring them as, it's not got a great weight of history or even theory behind it. It's just an interest, and that's fine. She backed it up with some kind of structural drawing of what she imagined it might look like. I've no doubt it wouldn't have looked like that had she even gone ahead and made it. She didn't actually make this work. And then you had another student, same year, same course. This was actually when we still had a sculpture degree, a sculpture course. We now teach across all kinds of media, and we don't silo them. This is a very different kind of a proposal. It's got all the hallmarks of a more rigorous, academically structured, or perhaps more like a proposal you might make to a funding body or even to a gallery. So it outlines the framework, outlines what she's going to do, etc. And it's very, it's rigorous, it makes sense, it's very, I can imagine what it would look like. I can look at both of those and put them on an equal footing. I can imagine work that will come out of either of them. But actually neither of those students made anything like what they said they were going to make. And that, to me, is the important thing. It doesn't really matter what we ask them to do. We still have to be very flexible, and they have to be flexible to be able to actually not do the thing they think they're going to do. Most funding bodies recognize this as well. You get the money for one thing, you do something else. As long as you let them know, you're usually okay. Depends how badly off, if you suddenly bought a house in Toorak in Melbourne, maybe it'd be different. So our crits, we have a different kind of a crit to the ones Michael described, slightly different, and I wanted to outline what those differences are. So, we don't use green screen. I'm not sure what happened there. There we go. Okay, so these are some very excited students looking at someone's work in a very empty space. I think that was the end of a very long day. That's not necessarily typical. We don't normally sit around the work, but it does happen at the end of the day. The kind of crits we do, so we ask our students to take work out of their studio space, to be able to look at it in a new way, to be able to see what it's doing differently to what they are sort of used to it doing in their studio space. In the studio, you've got all these tendrils of meaning that are coming from all the other references you have around it that are supporting the work, and they make you see the work differently. As soon as you put it into a different kind of a frame, as problematic as that white frame may be, it is still a different way of relating to that work, and that's a very important thing for students to get used to as an idea. It changes the work, and it makes it something different. They have to declare what the work is. They are saying this is the work, not this plus, that palette over there and all these other bits and pieces. They're declaring what the work is. The other thing that happens is the mode of critique that I sort of push is the one where students don't actually talk about their work. So they sit back and they hear feedback about the work directly. This is not an unusual method. I've used it a lot in lots of different art school contexts. I used to refer to it as the Goldsmiths method because it was taught to me by someone who went through Goldsmiths in London. But I suspect it's not their method either. It's just got a good moniker. This is actually a tutor, Bridie Lunny, talking. The girl who was speaking first was actually at the other end of the process where you do get to talk about the work. So the first part of it is you sit back, people are reading the work for what they see in the work. So you're hearing very kind of clean feedback, as clean as it can be. I mean, these are students with their peers, and it's one cohort, so they kind of know each other a bit. but they are able to read the work for what is actually presented to them. So on the one hand, students who are talking about the work get that practice to articulate what it is they're actually thinking about, how it is they're seeing this thing that's in front of them. And they have to choose words. And we sort of disallow just blanket statements like, I like the red, or, you know, maybe it could be bigger, that kind of thing. It's more really trying to get through the material sort of observations down into the content that may or may not be there in the work. And the content is not necessarily the owner, you know, it's not necessarily owned by the artist or the student in this case. The content is sometimes in the work and they don't know it. Sometimes work is funny when it was meant to be serious, and sometimes it's serious when it's meant to be funny. Sometimes it's a bit of both. I'm not sure what's happening with the... That's a student who's had a really rough day at the back. But there are very interesting things that happen when you allow yourself to sort of sit back from the work as a student and hear this other feedback. I get people to take notes separately, so the person who is actually hearing the feedback can hear it orally. You know, they get that opportunity to actually just take it in, see the body language, look at the way people are looking at it. If everyone's sort of going around not wanting to speak, and that happens too, there's a lot of, you know, empty space where people don't speak at all. It's a very telling thing about what is going on in the work, so it's very important. We'll move along. So that you'll see a lot, there's a lot of, you know, a lot of discomfort to begin with. But, you know, you ride with it. And as a tutor, what you're trying to do is facilitate that conversation by not stepping in with a sort of authorizing voice of what this work is, but actually allowing that discussion to be developed and made by the students themselves, because it's a two-way pedagogical scenario where the attendees are learning how to articulate, and they're learning about their own kind of precepts and perceptions. They're learning about the whole thing of what their work is, and the person whose work it is learning about what's working, what's not working. They can be very funny. People, you know, once people get used to the idea of this mode, you can go on for a really long time. Michael Asher's few hours, I mean, I think some of them went for 12 hours, and that was torture, but the hours are like 20 minutes, half an hour. And it's usually quite a fun process, even though there's lots of standing around like that. You'll see, so this is a group, so those previous examples were first years first, and then the last ones were second years, these are third years. They're a bit more, it's hard to see in this, but I know those all groups, they're a lot more comfortable at this stage with the whole process, and they're much more free in their discussion. And they will say amazing things. Sometimes you get really quiet people who are just judging that work in such a salient sort of mode. It's incredible, but they have to be addressed to make that, they have to feel like they can make a contribution. So sometimes as a lecturer, that's what you're doing, is just waiting to see if there is someone who's actually burning with something really coherent and cogent to say about the work, but not necessarily able to say it straight away. The studio can look like this, right? So a laptop perched on some books with some rope hanging up, and you know, it's a really odd space for looking at work, and that's another reason why we insist on trying to take work out of it. But you can see how all of these references go into somebody's work, and you can't always disentangle what is you know, the most important thing about the student's work. Sometimes the way that rope has been hanging there for a couple of weeks has really informed some of their thinking. So it's a very important thing to go in there with questions rather than answers. And so that's a kind of approach that I take with students, is that when you're in the one-on-one tutorial phase, which is a different mode to the group critique, you really are there facilitating conversation between each other and trying to get to the nub of what the work is actually about. Okay, so this is, second play, yeah. So this is a current third year student working on a group of works where she's actually cast paintings. So she's made these, she's a painter, but she was thinking about the object status of painting, if you like. And so quite, you know, sensibly. She's thought, well, I'll cast the painting, I'll make that an object and see what that becomes. So in that process, she also discovered some of those happy accidents that happen, such as the cast not, the mold not quite taking, and the plaster not setting properly, and then you get these holes, and they open up this other space, and it becomes really interesting. And she is a really interesting student in the way she is aware of every little minute detail of these works. But I came in and went, oh, how come you haven't finished these things? The annoying lecturer just comes and says, yeah, but the support isn't good enough, And it's that thing, and that's kind of what we do as well, is that we will, agonize over really tiny details about things, but it's because every little thing becomes significant. The moment you take it into an art context, a gallery context, it is analyzed to death. And so if we don't analyze it there, and the artist doesn't know how to analyze it, then they haven't got that critical faculty to actually judge the work before it goes into the gallery situation. And that's a really important thing. So it's hard, sometimes it's hard to do that to a student, but you have to do it in such a way that's supportive, is that you're actually trying to actually read the work and take it as seriously as it really is. Okay, so now this is the other part. So this is part, sort of the other side of it, where it's more about my own practice. So this is a work from, I haven't been paying attention to the time, but you've got your signs, Jenny, that's right, good. This is a work from 2003. It's, as you can see, it's a large structure. It's about 6 by 6 meters. It had 5 video works. They were all conceived of as distinct videos, but had a collective relationship, if you like. And it was shown at ACCA in Melbourne, which is the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. It's a large cavernous space, shiny black floor, a little bit like an 80s nightclub in some parts. It's got no right angles whatsoever, except for where the floor meets the wall. So everything else is on this kind of kooky angle. And all I wanted to do, I mean, at this point, this is my narrative now, all I wanted to do was to reinstate this kind of modernist plane of the square into that space, into this sort of postmodern proposition of all things, anything goes, and to set it at such an angle that the viewer had to circumnavigate the work. They could never see the whole work in one go. They had to negotiate this object, which was both a sculptural proposition and an architectonic feature. It's set on an incline, and so you weren't ever stable with that work. You had to sort of negotiate around it. Where that work came from was all these little, I was based in Amsterdam at the time. I hadn't ever seen the gallery. I didn't know really much about it. I knew Juliana Emberg, who's the curator, and I'd visited the space once. So I had to make a model of the space, develop this idea, and my narrative, looking at it, back in time, is I can see it all makes sense. I had this idea and I executed it in these different ways. But actually, really, it was just, it was more like that cloud description. There were lots of little things going on at once, and the videos were one part, and the sculpture thing was another part, and this relationship to materials was another part. And I was playing in a tiny little space, which was actually converted quarters in a postgraduate center called the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. And I auditioned materials for these things that I thought they could do, and I liked the idea that they could stand in for other kinds of things. And I would do sort of stupid things with them. And the studio is really that space to suspend your sense of what it is you're doing with any critical eye, and allow yourself to be that dumb person who sticks a piece of cork and an eraser and a foam together and goes, what could that be? Because it has some other kind of meaning. You're investing it, encoding it with all these other kinds of meaning. And it comes from things that you see around the world, observations in the world, and thinking about how they might tie into things you're doing. I mean, this sort of photography now is just like, that's all Instagram is. It's just giving everyone that ability to go, oh yeah, I make those photographs. And everyone does. And everyone is actually interested in very similar things who takes that kind of photograph. And then it was fused with things that I was doing in the studio as well, which were kind of deliberate attempts to articulate something about the nature of space, the nature of truth, the nature of the camera as a truth teller, and I suppose in some respects about narrative as a general proposition. A lot of these things were ideas that didn't really, didn't quite work out. When I did this thing, I thought it was going to fill up my entire space, the whole floor, and it just made this weak little proposition on the floor, but I still quite liked it. And at the same time, I worked with a model to sort of start mapping out and thinking through, and there are all these other, I couldn't find, I wanted to show you the real failures, the ones that were just ridiculous, but I couldn't even find them, so I didn't honor them enough, as it were, in the process. But there were lots of different ways, so I had to think about, I was interested in tables as the idea of a proposition, in 5 minutes, okay, and thinking about how the plane, how this planar space could form or serve as a platform for ideas and thinking. And I was making sets, so-called sets, which were really tests and then became the actual video. And I'll show you a little bit of the video, even though I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to burn a couple of those minutes. Is that playing? No? Okay. Oh, we lost sound. Oh no, sorry. Burn your ears off, sorry. So you can see for me, these were characters. It goes back to that animation. These had agency in the context that I was drawing. But they did things unexpectedly for me. I didn't quite know what they would do. And it talked to me about still life, about video, about the camera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on. I'm going to skip ahead. You can guess where it goes. It goes right around. The other thing was the idea of video as a slice of reality. So the video was something I could slice into the space and become an equivalent to the gallery space. So I made these model-like screens that could be, they could facilitate an image within a very bright gallery space. And so you come back to that. And then what happens is that for me, all the things that go into from the studio are invested into that work. And that's kind of hopefully what I would say, not just that, but there's this cloud of meaning that can be hovering over any artwork. And it can go off in all kinds of unpredictable ways. Okay, now we're jumping ahead. And I'm going to do this really racingly because I realize we're out of time. I want to show a very different kind of work because there is time between these two things, 13 years in fact. But this was the Australia Council application for a new body of work exploring light and colour. And really what I was looking at, you can't quite see it because you're all obsessed with the Star Trek characters, so if I just beam them out, there we go. Then you see what I'm really looking at is the space around the characters and the way light was used as a means to paint the frame. And it was a cheap way for the Star Trek producers to create the sense of the other via light and colour, just using really simple scenery flats to project onto. And for me, that made the idea of the video space or the space of production. I became interested in folding out what I had previously stuck into this tiny little box, making that the whole gallery space. And so this was a work from last year, Anne Schwartz Gallery, where I used a number of kind of components, including this large flat disc, which lit in a certain way, rendered it like a large voluminous sphere, and played into the theatrical. I allowed myself what I hadn't allowed myself earlier. Before, I was really just trying to be kind of clinical and restrained and just to look at this idea of truth in a very specific way. I then flipped it on its head and allowed myself to explore what would happen if the theatre became the work, so to speak. So the space could actually be choreographed around the viewer, and the viewer became this the agent in the video themselves. Because we're out of time, I'm going to skip ahead to there's video documentation. Maybe I can just let that play over some questions if there happen to be questions. All right, so I'll play a bit of that underneath. So that was all in the 30 minutes class. And that's the effect. Hi.
Daniel, thank you for your talk, and you talk so wonderfully on your practices, you know, both as an artist and as a teacher. What I want to ask about is how they're related. Do they inform one another?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they have to be. I think they always are. I think you mentioned, you know, there are idiosyncrasies in the way certain teachers teach. And I've been kind of aware of not being that teacher. You know, there are teachers who essentially form, you know, these cliques of acolytes. To me, you know, my practice, I'm interested in the way we construct the world, and so I've always looked at teaching as a kind of active process between, you know, two participants, and trying to, you know, dissolve the roles on some level, but also recognizing that actually there is this power dynamic that exists no matter what. In the end, it's you know, us that gives the marks. And was that me? No, oh good, yeah. It's part of the video, I didn't remember. So yeah, I really enjoy the dialogue that comes from teaching in art school and attempting to articulate, you know, what I see in a student's work. Students' work is very hard because sometimes what they think they're doing is simply not what they're doing. And sometimes what they think they're interested in isn't really what they're interested in. And sometimes, you know, there is just nothing there. It's a really challenging space in a way to work in. But to try and get the best out of each person as they present themselves is really rewarding as well. So, you know, I mean, I can just fall onto lots of cliches about teaching, but, you know, I do find it a rewarding practice myself. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Joseph, is it? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. Actually, I really enjoyed that. Yeah, so my question is about language and the way that you were trying to get students to articulate what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I was particularly interested in the charts that you offered towards the beginning, sort of 3 different ways that you see students moving from idea to the final artwork. Mm-hmm. So I was particularly interested in the middle one. Yeah. Got these different directions that artists can take in the art-making process. So really what my question is about is whether whether you think that language is both coextensive with and aligns with all the ways that artists can engage meaningfully with artworks in the art-making process. So I was thinking of an artist engaging in that process, and they might take one move to be called for rather than another. Yeah. And so I take it what you're claiming, or what's going on, is that that's always going to be something that we can articulate. So linguistically, we can find words to explain why we take that move to be appropriate and not another one. But is it possible that sometimes there just won't be? Sometimes we might just feel that one move is appropriate, not another, or just see it or something.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm interested in. And I mean, I didn't say this explicitly, but I think one of the things that drives me to be an artist and not a writer, for example, or to be not an illustrator, is I think the possibility of contradiction and paradox is actually a really productive space. And I think a lot of artists like that something is irresolvable, that you can have tension and that's not a problem, that you can just actually have an artwork that is simultaneously, you know, got beauty and chaos, and that's okay. You know, and it's kind of you can use words around it, but you don't necessarily get to the point of it. So that's where, you know, I like language, and I've always liked language. I don't use it directly in my work most of the time, but it's something I think about. But insofar as it is a way of thinking the world into being, and that's what has, you know, interests me, is that in the studio process, there is a point which is a bit like, you know, that there's a, what's his name, Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, the idea of flow, this idea of flow, if you look it up. And it's not unique to him. It's got historical, you know, underpinnings in lots of traditions, but that you can be lost in a process that is very engaging, and that there is not necessarily this interruption of narrativizing as you go. So you lose sense of time and self in that. So subjectivity is suspended in a certain sense. And the closest I've seen, you know, I've seen the effects of stroke or injury on the brain where the language center might be just temporarily shut off. And when people try to re-articulate what it was like, you know, they struggle because there was this directness that is not, it's just outside of language. So to me, I think they somehow coexist, but I think we suppress that. Language is such a dominator, and it always wants to jump in, like that video, like that animation. It jumps in and determines what it is we're seeing, and therefore you can't step out of that very easily. You need all these things to orchestrate the stepping out somehow. Don't know if that answers the question. It's a funny image to just hang on. Yes, there's a hook.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. So I have a question, Daniel.
Yeah.
When you were creating the shapes, talking to each other in a certain way, having agency, are you thinking of them as you, I don't know the mechanics of how you create what you create, but are you, when you see them in the finished product or as you're going along in the process, are they becoming are they personified in a certain way, whether you give them names or not? But I mean, how humanistic or humanoid are they?
Yeah, I mean, when I said I auditioned some of those objects, yeah, it's very much like that. Like I'm interested in. I mean, at that point, I'm not doing so much of that. I mean, I still do it, but I do it more with my children now. So, you know, it's got a. It was just training really for parental, you know, activities. I think it's something we all do on some level, but you know, some of us enjoy it more than others, and some of us make.
Well, there's a children's book. I was thinking, is it Shel
which?
Shel Silverstein. That's it. Yeah, called The Missing Piece. It may be an American thing. Anyway, there's a circle and a triangle, and I haven't read them in a long time, but it moves around, and it's very. Children cry, get excited, you know, and you're watching a thing become part of a whole, not become part of a whole, etc. So I'm just sort of wondering what you put into the things.
The thing that interests me is that you can anthropomorphize the objects, and to a certain degree, and you can go as far as you like with that. But what interests me is that you can have both. You can have the object, and you can have its anthropomorphization. So you've got those two concurrent, discordant propositions existing in the one moment. And that I like that more than either other. It's just that the mere fact that actually that's a complex proposition, that they can be both. And that's what children do very, very well. They will play in an imaginative way and call something, whatever it is they want to call it, a kangaroo or whatever. And they're not really, it's not as though they're idiots. They're not believing that's a kangaroo. They're imagining it.
So just one
suspending. But the joy is in the fact that the chair is a bit like a kangaroo. It's the hovering, and it's like when you find joy in puns, which I do. You know, it's you're letting meaning slip between the rigid categorizations, and that's the thing that excites me more. Yeah.
David. Sorry.
Daniel, that was really articulate, and there's so many things to discuss, but I just want to talk about something that just intrigued me. You talked about the work in terms of truth, and when I think about truth, I think about, you know, something that is linguistic, so, you know, a proposition or assertion, but the work is in some sense not being linguistic, even if it invites all sorts of linguistic responses. It is in an important way mute, right? It's not making an assertion, it's not making a claim, and that's important for you. You just said, you know, that there's this sort of ambiguity or something, you know, hovering. So why say truth? I just wondering, because it's not obviously not the way a philosopher hears that. I mean, because
I mean, truth's a really problematic word, right? I mean, that's why I said it. It's called, the work was called the truth effect. So,
right.
You know,
so I'm wondering about that.
Yeah. Well, that's a paradoxical idea, right? It's an oxymoron. It's either one or the other, and the camera purports a truth. So really, at that point, what I was interested in is the way video constructs a space and constructs an idea of the world, and it does that whether you want it to or not. So the idea, let's just say the ground plane of that video, with the objects moving around it. The ground is not the ground. We assume the ground because that's just what we're used to. You know, we're used to that horizontal line in the lower part of the, whatever the image is the ground. And we will defend that, you know, whether we want to or not. And as soon as the objects start going around in a different way, we don't adjust that easily, because the camera is purporting such a rigid and strong truth about what it says is happening, which is that these are agents moving on their own volition around that space. When really it's that shonky piece of carpentry and tape and cardboard, rolling it on a piece of foam and watching it on the screen and timing it so that the thing falls in a certain way. And I like that you can know that.
Right.
And it doesn't, it's still, the trick, if you like, the trick of perception is still there. And it's the same as that imaginative space, that you can have these coexisting, it's almost like cognitive dissonance. It just doesn't they don't gel, but they don't produce a negative reaction. They produce a kind of, to me, an interesting reaction.
So there it's like the assumptions you're bringing to the work.
Yeah, that's right. But I think, I mean, it's not just the work, I mean, it's the world. That's where my interest in philosophy lies, is that's just an encapsulation. It's easier to look at it in the art context because we have this great reified space of the gallery, which we can just accept as, oh, white walls, neutral, you know, problematic, but, you know, it still persists. We have a wall, we put something on the wall, art, or anything that happens in the gallery, art. And then we take a certain kind of response to it, we interrogate it. And that's really useful for then extrapolating out, or I think it should be useful, for extrapolating out into our engagement with the world proper, whatever that may be.
I'd just like to close with another question, actually, that's bringing philosophy and visual art together. In philosophy, what an individual does is very much the creation of a community, because if you're getting published, you've got a whole set of people that are refereeing your work. It's not going to get published if they don't think it's relevant. Your whole career is a sort of procession of critiques against your work that you have to respond to. So in the end, you know, what's getting published and what's being found interesting is based on, you know, a whole community. So it's not just an individual work in that sense. Now I'm wondering about visual art. I mean, we have, you know, part of the narrative, I suppose, that the public often have of visual artists is that it's all, you know, self-expression and so on. I mean, you guys would sort of have a lot of jokes about that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering, though, in terms of attributability and accountability, so you attribute the work to the individual, that happens in philosophy, but accountability, you just wonder, who's accountable here? It's really the community, because if the community didn't see what you were doing as relevant, it wouldn't get any hearing, you know, it wouldn't get...
And the attribution of traits in these objects is kind of an extension of trying to empathize or understand another. right, and other out in the world, and what their actions or motivations might be. So that's one thing. Then you get to the art situation. So as the artist, I mean, you're always working, ideally, always working towards the idea of presenting something to the world, to a public, whatever that public may be, even if it's quite a specialized cognoscenti that's going to see the work. It's still public, and it's tricky because you don't know. I think Sean and Claire said this too. You don't really know what's going to happen once it's out in the world. So that work with the table, I can look at that. It's easy for me to talk about that now. That was 13 years ago. At the time, that was heart-stopping. I had no idea whether it was going to be able to be pulled off at the scale. I hadn't worked at something in that scale. To get the finish I wanted, for it to work, it had to be a seamless plane. And it was quite tricky to realize as a physical thing on the one hand, but even as a proposition, is this going to make sense, or is anybody going to care, And you get weird reactions. I had one guy at the opening had a ball in his pocket, and he rolled it down the thing. So it was kind of like that's what I think of your work, mate. It just sort of, it was a really funny gesture, and he may not have even really thought about that, but it was quite a weird thing to do. But I think the work is in social space, and I think it's a very much a shared thing. There is some aspect of what the artist declares as the work, but actually you give it over. You totally give it over. And in the end, it's whatever others say. I mean, something we didn't, I wanted to talk about in relation to narrative was International Art English, and the press releases and the artist statements, and all those things we're forced to sort of write at different stages to help kind of construct the work, and how much closure that can bring to a work in a dangerous way, in a sense, that it actually stops it down, and that it's trying to make the artist's voice the last thing, but actually most artists I know don't really want to do that. They don't want to be declaring, this work is about A, B, and C. They want that field of relations, and they want the kind of push and pull of the work to.
But most people disagree. I mean, there's art that's hundreds of years old that we're still talking about because
Sure.
everyone, we all disagree.
Yeah.
So, I mean.
But imagine you had the artist on YouTube talking about that work, and that day they chose to talk about narrative A.
Yeah, that could
it's locked.
Yeah,
and that's a problem. Even this, it's going to be, it's locked in space and time.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you so much, and
Thank
thank you to all our speakers.